Still chasing uniforms over unity? You disappoint me. That message lit up my phone seconds before the chapel doors opened. No name, no warmth, just my father's voice in 5 words, echoing 2 decades of silence. I wore white that day, just not his kind. 4 stars on my shoulders, the man I loved waiting at the altar, and behind me 200 Navy SEALs stood in formation. Then a voice rang out, "Admiral on deck!" Every man rose, not for tradition, not for blood, but for honor. And that's when I knew this wasn't a wedding, it was a reckoning earned in silence. The phone vibrated against my palm like a pulse out of rhythm. 5 words stared back at me, cold and clipped. Still chasing uniforms over unity, you disappoint me. No name, no punctuation, but I knew exactly who sent it. Colonel William Collins didn't need introductions. His disapproval came preloaded in every syllable. I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen until the letters blurred. The glow of the chapel lights above me cast a faint reflection on my dress whites. 4 stars rested on my shoulders, each earned, each endured. And behind me, lined in quiet formation, stood 200 SEALs, men who'd bled, fought, and followed my voice through fire. They weren't invited. They came anyway. Outside those doors was the man I loved, David Linwood, civilian, brilliant, steady, no medals, no rank, just the kind of presence that never shook, even when mine did. He stood at the altar, not waiting for a bride in lace, but a woman in command. The chapel itself was modest, military precision in every pew. No flowers, no aisle runner, no string quartet, just polished wood, brass detailing, and walls that had absorbed the prayers and grief of 1,000 ceremonies. It wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to bear witness. I adjusted the cuffs of my jacket, brushed an invisible speck from my ribbons. My gloves were perfectly white, my heels silent against the marble beneath me. I was every inch the officer they knew. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if I was still the daughter he had once hoped for. The doors hadn't opened yet, but in my mind, others already had. They led back decades, to a childhood laced with orders, not lullabies, where good job was replaced with do better, where emotions were folded away like old fatigues. I'd grown up in a house where you stood at attention before you spoke, where mistakes were debriefed like field ops. He wanted a son. He got me. And from the moment I showed interest in the military, not as a whim but as a path, the gulf between us became an ocean. I remembered standing at 12 years old in his study, fingers brushing medals encased in glass, eyes wide with admiration. He noticed, scolded me for touching what wasn't earned, and then turned away, leaving me alone with my breath caught and my wonder dismissed. "You're too soft," he once told me when I cried after my mother's chemotherapy. "Emotion won't get you through the battlefield." But it was emotion that got me through every deployment, through every night when the radio went silent, through every knock on the door I delivered in full dress uniform, telling wives and husbands that their beloved wouldn't be coming home. I never let him see that. I never let anyone see it, except David. The text still glowed in my hand, a sting in digital form, but instead of anger, I felt something unexpected, clarity. It wasn't the cruelty that hurt, it was the consistency. The way his absence always managed to fill a room more than his presence ever had. I breathed in. The chapel doors would open soon. And I would walk, step by step, not toward validation, but toward choice. Toward a man who loved all of me. Toward comrades who saluted, not because they had to, but because they chose to. He wouldn't be there, but they were, and maybe that in the end was enough. I remembered the auditorium, how the air hung heavy with the scent of waxed wood and cheap cologne. Graduation night. My cap askew, diploma clutched in hand, I stood beaming under fluorescent lights, ready to share the decision that had kept me awake for weeks. "I got in," I told him. "Naval Academy, full scholarship." The buzz of the crowd seemed to dull for a second as I looked up at my father, hoping, foolishly, for a flicker of pride. Instead, he took a deliberate step back. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said, voice just loud enough for nearby families to hear. "Stop pretending this is your world." I froze. Around us, classmates posed with proud parents, flashbulbs going off like celebratory gunfire. But I was locked in a different kind of exposure, public rejection. His voice had a way of cutting clean and deep. "Tell your mother to stop filling your head with stories. The military doesn't need little girls playing soldier." I didn't cry. Not then. I smiled at the camera when a teacher offered to take our picture, even though he refused to stand beside me. He waited at the exit, arms crossed, until I joined him in silence. At home, the celebration was subdued. No banners, no cake, just the clink of silverware and the hum of a news anchor droning in the background. My mother, Margaret, tried to compensate with soft touches and subtle glances. Her joy for me came in sideways smiles and quiet affirmations after he left the room. She was everything he wasn't, warm, curious, unafraid of nuance. A high school literature teacher who quoted Emily Dickinson at the breakfast table and believed in the power of metaphors more than medals. "You were born to weather storms," she told me once, "but not to stay inside them forever." She called me her stormbird. She believed I was strong because of my heart, not in spite of it. When I left for Annapolis, she was the one who packed extra socks, almond butter, and annotated poems into my duffel bag. She was the one who called every Sunday, her voice a lifeline from another world. And she was the one who disappeared too quickly. It started with fatigue, then hair loss, then a whispered diagnosis spoken over a staticky phone line, late-stage breast cancer. But I didn't hear it from her. I found out through a family friend. By the time I returned home, she was in hospice, frail, hollow-eyed. And he, Colonel William Collins, stood by the window, arms crossed, posture perfect, saying nothing. Not even when I knelt beside her, hand in hers, whispering promises I couldn't keep. She died before dawn. He never called me to say she was dying, never even said the word cancer aloud. When I asked why, he simply said, "Distractions break focus." The funeral was clinical. Military precision, folded flags and piped hymns, no tears from him. Just that same steely mask watching from a distance as if grief were a spectator sport. Afterward, he returned to his office. I packed what remained of my mother's scent from the bedroom, lavender and old pages, and left before sunset. There were no goodbyes, no doorframe hugs, no last-minute regrets, just the sound of my boots on the gravel and his silhouette in the window, still, silent, backlit by a house that had never really been home. I didn't look back, because sometimes the deepest cuts don't bleed, they calcify. And you learn to walk with them, stiff but upright. I became an officer with that weight in my spine. And now, years later, on the day I was to be married, I could still feel the outline of that absence, sharp and unforgiving, as clearly as the creases I'd ironed into my uniform just hours ago. The first day at the Naval Academy felt more like a purge than an orientation. They stripped us of our names, our identities, our softness. Shouted commands were our new lullabies, and punishment came faster than understanding. As one of the few women in the incoming class, and the only one in my platoon, I was instantly a target. They didn't need to say it aloud. It was in their stares, in the tightened jaws and exchanged glances when I walked into a room. I was affirmative action. I was quota filler. I was the mistake they'd regret. By week 2, the rumours started. One male cadet told the others I cried during a night drill. Another claimed I skipped a conditioning session because of female issues. None of it was true, but truth rarely wins when doubt has already taken root. I learned quickly to keep my mouth shut and my fists clenched in my pockets. Every slip, every stutter, every missed second on the timed runs was amplified. I started sleeping in my workout clothes, just to avoid the 10-second delay that might get me screamed at 4 o'clock a.m. The walls of the dorm were covered in portraits of men, heroes immortalized in frames. Not one woman, not one reminder that someone like me could belong here. It was during a particularly brutal week, a stretch of back-to-back drills under relentless rain, that I finally collapsed. My legs gave out mid-obstacle course, knees scraping against gravel, palms torn open as I tried to brace. I tasted blood and mud. The instructors didn't stop the timer. I dragged myself up, finished the course, crossed the line 7 seconds over the requirement. "Fail!" one barked. No sympathy, no adjustment for blood loss, just the cold click of a stopwatch. That night, I sat in the corner of the locker room, alone. My uniform soaked, skin burning. I pressed a towel to my knees, the blood soaking through anyway. That's when I heard it, a voice from the shadows near the lockers. "You're standing too wide on the vault. Tighten your base. Tuck on the second leap." I turned, startled. A woman stood there, maybe late 40s. Fit, steady. She wore civilian workout gear, but her bearing screamed military. She stepped forward, handed me gauze from her bag, then sat on the bench across from me like she belonged there. I was you, 22 years ago. Her name was Commander Leah Tran. She had once been in line to become the first woman admitted to a classified SEAL track, but politics and prejudice shut her out weeks before selection. "They said I had the grit, but not the optics," she said, voice even. Now she trained from the sidelines, quietly, invisibly. She started showing up at odd hours, at the track during sunrise, in the mess hall late at night, always just watching, never interfering, but sometimes she'd whisper corrections when no one was around, tiny adjustments that shaved seconds, strengthened form, and most importantly, kept me from breaking. She told me once, "They think resilience is about not falling. It's about how clean you get back up." I started running faster. My upper body strengthened. My endurance tripled. No one noticed, not officially, but the failures stopped. And I began to look my instructors in the eye again, not out of defiance, but clarity. Commander Tran never asked for thanks, never asked me to mention her name, but she was the reason I endured. There were still bad days, days when my body screamed for rest and my mind for silence, nights when I soaked through shirts with cold sweat after weapons drills. But every time I felt the urge to quit, I imagined her watching from the shadows, and I stood a little straighter. Storms don't disappear. But eventually you learn to move with them, to use their force instead of fighting it. And somewhere in that chaos, I stopped being the girl trying to prove her father wrong. I became the woman quietly proving herself right. The call didn't come from my father. It came from Emma Callahan, a high school friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She found me through an old email thread from our school alumni list. "Your mum," she said quietly. "She passed last night." The world slowed, but my breath didn't. I waited for her to say it was a mistake, that the call was premature, that someone, anyone, had meant to tell me sooner. But all she could offer was, "I thought you knew." I hadn't. No message, no call, not from him. I called the house, straight to voicemail. I left a message, not angry, not emotional, just, "Why didn't you tell me?" I didn't expect a reply. 2 days later, I stood at the edge of my childhood home, suitcase in hand. The front porch looked smaller than I remembered. The garden overgrown, the stars on the flag by the garage had faded. Everything seemed dulled, as if the colour had drained from the frame. Inside, the silence was loud. My father was in the kitchen, polishing a silver coffee pot that hadn't been used in years. He didn't look up when I entered, just said, "She didn't want you pulled from your duties." I didn't answer. I walked past him, into the room where my mother had spent her final days. The air was thick with lavender oil and loss. Her books were still stacked on the nightstand, Leaves of Grass, Jane Eyre, Letters to a Young Poet. Her glasses rested on top, crooked, as if she'd only stepped away for a moment. On the dresser sat a sealed envelope with my name on it. My breath caught. I reached for it with a trembling hand. The handwriting was hers, delicate, looped, unmistakable. Inside was a letter and a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. The letter was short but intimate, like her. "My Stormbird," it began. "There's something you never knew. I had an offer once, direct commission. I was young, full of fire, but I was also pregnant, with you. I chose you. I never regretted it. But I want you to know, the uniform isn't just yours. It's ours. You're carrying both our dreams now. And whatever you do, don't let anyone make you feel like it was never meant for you." I stared at the letter for a long time. My hands trembled. Tears spilled before I realised they'd begun. The folded paper was a scanned acceptance letter from an officer training programme, dated months before I was born. She'd tucked it away for decades. Never told me. Never told anyone. The truth knocked the wind out of me. She'd wanted this life. She could have had it. But instead, she gave me mine. And the man who stripped me of support, of affirmation, he'd also stolen the chance for me to share this truth with her, to thank her while she was still breathing. I sat on the edge of her bed and made a vow out loud, though no one was there to hear it. I'll carry it. I'll wear it for us both. From that day forward, it wasn't just my career. It was a legacy reclaimed. Every mile run, every decision under pressure, every scar earned, it wasn't just to prove something to a father who couldn't see. It was for the mother who had seen everything before I even understood it. Back at the academy, I folded the letter and tucked it behind the name tag on my training fatigues. It stayed there through graduation, through my first deployment, through the night I earned my first medal under fire. It stayed there even after the ink faded from sweat and sun. And when anyone asked what kept me going through storms, I said nothing. But I thought of her, always her. My first deployment didn't feel like history in the making. It felt like nausea, sweat, and a rifle that weighed more than my confidence. The Adriatic operation was supposed to be routine. Intel said a rogue faction had taken hostages on a grounded freighter near the Croatian coast. What they didn't mention was the complexity: multiple hulls, overlapping languages, civilians mixed with armed personnel. I was a lieutenant commander then, still new enough to be underestimated, but already carrying the kind of scars that made you listen differently. My unit was tight, efficient, and mostly silent, just how I liked it. We breached at 0300, night vision painting the corridors in ghostly green. The ship creaked with the groan of old metal and tension. The hostages were huddled in the galley, tied and terrified. One insurgent spotted us before full neutralization. He panicked, lobbed a fragmentation grenade across the narrow passage. I don't remember yelling. I remember instinct. I dove over one of the hostages, young, maybe barely 20, helmet askew, mouth open in shock. The blast went off behind me, shrapnel slicing through my side like teeth. Heat bloomed across my ribs. I clamped my jaw to keep from screaming, focused only on the blood gushing from his leg. Femoral artery. If I hesitated, he'd die. I yanked off my belt and wrapped it tight, fingers slick with red. My other hand held pressure as I radioed for medevac. Everything after that blurred, except his eyes, wide, blue, desperate. He lived. I didn't know it at the time, but the soldier I'd saved was Second Lieutenant Nolan Green, and his father was General Arnold Green, commander of Joint Ground Operations, and a man who had once campaigned aggressively to block my early commissioning. He'd called me a political chess piece, someone better suited for publicity than proximity to danger. His words lived in transcripts I had forced myself never to reread. But fate has a way of circling back. By the time we landed back at base, I was stitched, stabilised, and refusing painkillers stronger than ibuprofen. I hated how narcotics blurred the edge. I wanted to feel everything. Every throb reminded me I had chosen right. I had moved without pause. I had saved a life. 2 weeks later, I received a promotion recommendation, hand-delivered by the operations chief. "Fast-tracked from above," he said, tapping the folder. I knew what that meant. Politics, optics, recognition. It should have felt tainted, but it didn't. Inside the folder was a handwritten note. "I've reviewed the full incident report. Your actions saved my son, but more importantly, your judgment saved the team. My prior assessments of your capacity were flawed, green. No rank, no title, just green." I sat with the letter for an hour, unsure what I was supposed to feel. Vindication? No. That implied I'd needed his validation to begin with. What I felt was colder, sharper, a quiet fracture inside me between who I was and how they'd always tried to define me. Bloodlines break not from arguments, but from slow erosion. And sometimes the most ironic victories aren't loud. They're silent recognitions scribbled in ink and delivered by the very hands that once tried to erase you. I never responded to Green. I didn't need to. My rank would do the talking from then on. 2 months after the Adriatic operation, I stood on a stage at Naval Station Rota, gold sunlight bouncing off polished brass and crisp white uniforms. My side still ached if I twisted too fast, a reminder that healing and honour don't arrive on the same timeline. The Navy Distinguished Service Medal was pinned to my chest by a Vice Admiral I barely knew, but the applause that followed felt less like ceremony and more like acknowledgement. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe I was seen, not just for surviving, but for leading. Later that night, alone in my quarters, I took out a note card and wrote the shortest letter I'd ever sent. "Awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal today. I thought you should know. Avery." I didn't ask for anything, no congratulations, no acknowledgement, just facts, just history. I addressed it to the house I hadn't stepped foot in since my mother's funeral. I imagined him reading it, expression blank, then discarding it like a misdelivered package. Weeks passed. No reply. I didn't expect one. Then during a formal banquet at the Pentagon, I crossed paths with someone unexpected. Commander Harris, an old friend of my father's from West Point. He was older now, face weathered and eyes sharper than ever. "Avery Collins," he said, shaking my hand. "Heard you dragged a bleeding lieutenant under fire. Didn't think the old man's daughter had it in her." His tone wasn't mocking, just direct. I smiled, out of habit. "Neither did he." He hesitated, swirling bourbon in his glass. "You know, he never told me he was proud, but he did show me something last time I visited." My breath caught. "He keeps your academy photo in his study," Harris continued. "Framed, no medals, no fanfare, just you in uniform, standing straight like your spines carved from steel." I stared at him, stunned. "Since when?" "Year after you got your first command." Said it was for reference. He chuckled dryly, but I saw the way he looked at it, like he couldn't decide if he'd built you or lost you. I didn't say anything for a long time. I had spent years thinking he hated me, that my name tasted like failure on his tongue. But maybe it wasn't hate. Maybe it was shame. Shame that I had become everything he claimed I couldn't, that I had walked through the same fire and come out not only intact but decorated. He didn't reject me because I was weak. He rejected me because I shattered his definition of strength. That realization struck harder than any reprimand he'd ever given, because in that moment, I understood. It wasn't me he couldn't look at. It was the mirror. He had believed the military belonged to men. That command was only for voices like his. That obedience was more important than innovation, posture more powerful than empathy, and I was living proof that he was wrong. He could hang my photo on the wall, but he couldn't face what it meant. That the legacy he tried to preserve by excluding me had evolved without him. That I had carried the torch forward, even when he refused to hand it off. I didn't send him another letter after that, not because I gave up, but because I didn't need him to see anymore. I had already been seen by the ones who followed, trusted and bled beside me. By the ones who called me ma'am, not out of obligation, but out of earned respect. And deep down, I knew something else. Even if he never said the words, he saw me too. I met David Linwood in the kind of setting that leaves no room for sentiment. Inside a grey briefing room at the Pentagon, where the walls were lined with threat matrices and budget charts instead of empathy. He was a civilian contractor recently assigned to a cybersecurity task force I'd been asked to consult. I didn't remember his name from the roster, only the tone he used when he interrupted me mid-briefing. "With all due respect, Admiral," he said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, "your recommended reporting structure adds unnecessary redundancy." The room went quiet. 4-star silence is louder than most gunfire. I studied him, calm, polished, a brain wired like a circuit board, and the confidence to match. He had no idea who I was beyond the bars on my collar. That, oddly, made me listen harder. "Redundancy isn't always inefficiency," I replied. "Sometimes it's resilience, especially when one breach collapses the whole system." He paused, then nodded. "Fair." The next morning, his revised report landed on my desk, reformatted in my structure but improved, clearer, smarter, with a handwritten note, "Clarity found, credit due, David." It was the first of many quiet collisions. In the weeks that followed, we were paired more often, at first out of protocol, then out of habit. We debated data flow over black coffee, argued strategic doctrines while walking across wind-chilled parking lots. And somewhere between late-night classified meetings and emergency drills, something softer formed beneath the tactical surface. He never flinched when I got direct, never backed away when I disagreed. He challenged without condescension, and more importantly, he listened like someone who didn't need to win to be right. The shift came gradually. The first real sign wasn't words. It was a shared silence on a rooftop overlooking DC, 2 mugs of tea between us, watching the planes blink across the dark sky. I told him then, "Command is lonelier than anyone tells you." He answered, "Then I'll just have to stand closer." But it wasn't all ease. One night, 6 weeks into something neither of us had labelled, he brought out an old photo, creased at the edges. A man in SEAL uniform, smiling, arms slung casually around a teammate I recognised. "This was Mark," David said. "My partner. He died 4 years ago. Northern Syria. His convoy was ambushed on a recon sweep." I stared at the photo longer than I should have. Because I remembered that operation. I remembered the radio silence, the fog of war, the names read in debrief. I had commanded the aerial overwatch team that night. The room felt colder, my lungs tighter. "I was part of that mission," I said, voice low. "Indirectly. We tried to extract. Timing failed. Terrain failed." David didn't blink. "I know," he replied. "I read the reports, months later. I memorised every name in that chain of command." I waited for anger or blame, but he only added, "And I still asked you to dinner." The silence stretched, not heavy, just fragile. "Why?" I asked. "Because losing Mark didn't make me hate the uniform, and meeting you reminded me that even in chaos, some things still deserve choosing." It wasn't a declaration. It was a surrender of a different kind. We didn't skirt the grief. We didn't bury the truth. We shared it, sat with it, named it. And in doing so, we made room for something neither of us expected, peace. David never proposed with fanfare. No kneeling under fireworks, no violin quartets, no hidden photographers waiting in the bushes. Just us, on a pier at dusk, boots hanging over the water, the wind catching the edge of my dress blues like breath. He held out a ring, modest, simple, a single stone, clear as his intentions. "Let me walk beside you," he said, "not in front, not behind, and never asking you to change." I looked at him, this man who had never once flinched at the scars I didn't talk about, who understood silence better than most do speeches. And I said, "Yes, with one condition." He nodded. "I wear my uniform." He smiled. "I didn't fall in love with a bride. I fell in love with a leader." We planned a small ceremony, naval chapel, spring light, no frills, no bridesmaids, no groomsmen, just the people who mattered. He chose a deep navy suit. I chose my dress whites, not to prove anything, just to be honest. It was the only outfit that had ever felt like truth. 2 weeks before the wedding, I sat alone in my quarters writing a card, just a few lines, no emotion, just logistics. I'm getting married, Naval Chapel, 1300 hours, Saturday. I'll be in uniform, you're welcome to attend. Avery. I mailed it to the only address I had left for him, the same house with the overgrown garden and faded flag. I didn't expect a reply, didn't even want one. But closure sometimes isn't for the recipient, it's for the sender. The days passed quickly. Final fittings, security arrangements, David's mother calling twice to make sure we'd serve real cake and not just MREs as a joke. I smiled more than I had in years. And then, the day before the wedding, a box arrived. No return address, no note. Just a small navy blue parcel wrapped precisely, military tight. Inside was a watch, not new, not polished, worn, familiar. I knew it instantly. It was my mother's. She used to wear it during lectures, tapping its face when students rambled past their time. After she passed, it disappeared. I had assumed it was buried with her or tossed out quietly, like so many other pieces of her that vanished without ceremony. But here it was, cleaned, repaired, the leather strap restitched, and on the back, newly engraved, for my stormbird, fly. The air left my lungs. I sat with the watch in my lap, hands unmoving, afraid that touching it too long might erase the moment. I flipped it over again and again, staring at the inscription, trying to decode the meaning between the lines. He hadn't signed it, hadn't written anything else. But I knew it was from him. My father didn't do apologies, didn't do speeches. He did orders and silence, but this wasn't either. This was a truce, a white flag, stitched not from surrender but from memory. I pressed the watch to my chest, eyes stinging, not because everything had healed, but because, for the first time in years, something had shifted. Not much, but enough to breathe. I didn't call him, didn't send thanks, but I wore the watch the next day, beneath the cuff of my dress uniform. Its weight against my wrist felt like a whisper I'd long forgotten how to hear. And when I stepped behind the chapel doors, waiting for them to open to 200 silent seals and one man who loved me exactly as I was, I touched the back of that watch and heard her voice again. Fly. And so I did. The chapel doors opened slowly, not with a creak, but with a hush, as if even the hinges understood what was about to unfold. Light poured through the stained glass windows, bathing the aisle in fractured gold and blue. My boots struck the floor in steady rhythm, measured, deliberate, not bridal, but ceremonial. I stepped forward, and then it happened. From the back of the room a voice rang out, clear, commanding, familiar. Admiral on deck. Every soldier, sailor, seal, and officer rose in perfect sync. Uniforms crisp, faces solemn, hands to brows, a wall of silent reverence. Not because tradition demanded it, but because respect did. I didn't falter. But my chest tightened. It wasn't the volume that caught me, it was the choice. They stood not for my title, but for what it took to earn it. Every step I took down that aisle felt less like a wedding march and more like a tribute, not to who I was becoming, but to the long, punishing, silent road that brought me here. To my left stood Chief Petty Officer Rhodes, his limp barely noticeable. To my right, Senior Officer Lopez, spine ramrod straight despite a prosthetic foot. Neither were supposed to escort me. Both insisted. "You walked us through hell," Rhodes had said, voice rough. "Let us walk you to something better." The chapel was packed. No music, no tears yet, just a stillness so loud it echoed. At the altar stood David, in a tailored navy suit, hands clasped behind his back, the exact stance I preferred when issuing orders. He wasn't crying, but his eyes shimmered in that way that told me he was absorbing every second. I reached him, gave a nod to my escorts, and they stepped back like ghostly honour guards, fading into the pews. The chaplain waited, letting the moment breathe, He wore his full dress, ribbons aligned like lines of history across his chest. We had once shared a tent in Kandahar after an airstrike took out a forward ops base. Today, he presided over peace. David took my gloved hands and whispered, "They didn't stand for a rank. They stood for you." I didn't reply, didn't need to, because in that instant, surrounded by those who had followed me into fire, who had listened when my voice crackled through chaos, I felt something that had always been missing. Not validation, not victory, recognition. The kind that doesn't require a last name to earn. The kind my blood never gave me, but my battle did. The vows were short, grounded, no promises about forever, just declarations to serve one another, protect peace, guard joy even when orders never came. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the room didn't erupt. It stilled. And then came the applause, low at first, then rising, thunderous, earned, honest. Outside, a sabre arch waited, held not by officers, but by enlisted men and women I'd served beside. A quiet rebellion of honour. The blades shimmered in spring light as we passed beneath. Later that evening, someone uploaded a clip, 30 seconds, handheld, shaky, but clear enough to see every face rise and salute. The caption read only, "Real respect isn't ordered, it's lived." By morning, the video had gone viral, inside secure networks. The quiet circles of the military began sharing it, not for gossip, for what it symbolised. A woman in uniform, not asking to be seen, but commanding it without a word. I'd spent decades feeling invisible in rooms full of brass. That day, I wasn't just seen, I was saluted. The morning after the wedding, long after the final champagne glass had been cleared and the last well-wisher had saluted and vanished into the spring dusk, I sat by the window of our temporary quarters, still in my undershirt and uniform slacks, hair loose for the first time in days. David was still asleep, breathing slow and steady, one arm folded across his chest like he was guarding something fragile. The watch, my mother's, rested on the nightstand. Its second hand ticked like a heartbeat. My phone buzzed, a message from Claire, my cousin on my mother's side. We hadn't spoken in months. She hadn't come to the wedding, caught up with her own deployment cycle, but she had promised she'd be watching from the wings. I opened the message, just a photo, grainy, shot from across the street, the chapel in frame, morning light casting long shadows on the lawn. And in the lower right corner, nearly cut off by the edge of the photo, stood a man, back straight. Dress uniform immaculate, arms crossed over his chest like a stone statue. My father. I zoomed in slowly, heart pounding. He hadn't changed much, still rigid, still pressed into precision, but his jaw wasn't clenched, his stance wasn't combative. He hadn't come to disrupt, he had come to watch. Outside the gates, just far enough to avoid being seen, but close enough to hear the echoes of that room when they shouted, "Admiral on deck," he had heard it, he had seen it, and he had chosen to stay outside. Another photo came through seconds later, same frame. But this time, he was walking away. Back turned, hands at his sides, gone before the vows, gone before the applause. I stared at the screen until it dimmed in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. Instead, I reached for the notebook I kept in the drawer beside the bed, the same one I'd started back in Annapolis, filled with mission notes, stray thoughts, poems I copied from my mother's old books. I turned to a blank page and wrote, "He saw me, and that was almost enough." Not because it fixed anything, but because it proved something I'd long suspected. He wasn't incapable of care, just terrified of what it would cost to show it. That night, after the toasts and laughter and a quiet dinner with just the two of us on the barracks rooftop, I sat beside David under a blanket of stars. The air smelled like salt and celebration. My hand was laced in his, thumb brushing the edge of his knuckle. He looked over at me and asked, gently, "Do you still wish he had walked in?" The question didn't sting, it settled. I looked up at the night sky, then down at my lap. "No," I said. "I wish he'd stood up." David nodded, said nothing else, just squeezed my hand a little tighter, because he understood what I meant. It wasn't about appearances. It wasn't about seating charts or speeches or forced smiles in family photos. It was about standing up for what you built, even if you didn't help build it. It was about saluting not the rank, but the journey. And in the end, he hadn't stood. He had watched and walked away. But me, I had stood. And so had 200 others. And maybe that was the only approval I ever truly needed. The invitation arrived in a cream-coloured envelope, the kind too stiff for junk mail and too elegant for anything routine. It was from the Department of Defence, an official request for me to deliver the keynote at the annual Strategic Command Leadership Summit. The event would gather top-ranking officers, civilian defence analysts, and political appointees from every branch. Panels, speeches, applause, ceremony. Normally I avoided these events when I could. Too much flash, not enough substance, but this one was different. They didn't ask me to speak about tactics or victories. They asked me to speak about ethics in command. I stared at the letter for a long time, and I knew exactly what I would say. When the night came, I wore my dress whites, not out of vanity, but out of truth. The ballroom pulsed with chatter and formality, men in gold-braided sleeves, and women with medals aligned like miniature memoirs. I stepped onto the stage beneath spotlights so bright they erased the crowd. I didn't read from a script. I spoke from the place they never trained us to acknowledge. Leadership, I began, is not just about issuing orders. It's about understanding why some orders aren't heard. I paused, scanning the room. I want to tell you a story, I continued, about a soldier named Private First Class Noah Ellison. You could feel the room lean in. Noah wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless. He passed every test, qualified early, led well in simulations, deployed twice, and on paper he was perfect. I let the silence breathe before the shift, until the day he didn't show up for roll call. That silence turned still. We found him hours later, sitting in a storage unit behind the motor pool, alive but fractured. His eyes were wide, but he didn't see us. His hands shook, even when nothing touched them. I sat beside him for an hour before he spoke. I tightened my grip on the podium, just slightly. He said, "Ma'am, it's too loud in my head. I can't find the off switch." I looked down, then back up. So I didn't give him orders. I didn't recite protocol. I just stayed. The room was so quiet I could hear someone shifting in their chair 3 rows back. I visited him every day for a week. No reports, no questions, just presence. And on the 8th day, he looked at me and said, "You didn't save me with orders. You saved me with silence." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, folded letter. "This," I said, unfolding it carefully, "is what he left me when he rotated out." I began reading aloud. "Dear Admiral Collins, I don't know if you remember me the same way I remember you. You didn't give me medals, you didn't give me speeches, you just sat beside me and didn't make the silence scary. You didn't rescue me from war. But you pulled me back from something even worse, being invisible inside of it. Thank you for seeing me, even when I stopped seeing myself." I folded the letter again, placed it back inside my jacket. "He passed 2 years later," I added quietly, "not by enemy fire, not by mistake, but from something none of us like to name. A pause, a breath. We call ourselves leaders, but leadership isn't loud. It's not polished. It doesn't always arrive with ceremony. Sometimes leadership is sitting in silence and letting someone borrow your calm until they find their own." When I finished, there was no applause. Not right away, just stillness. Then slowly they stood, row by row, not as tradition, but in recognition, for a story too often buried beneath protocols and promotions. That night, as I packed my things backstage, a young officer approached me, barely 25, eyes red-rimmed, standing at attention. "Ma'am," he said, voice cracking, "I was almost Noah. He saluted me. And for the first time in my life, I felt what it meant to be saluted not for rank, but for remembering what rank is supposed to mean. The envelope arrived 3 days later. No stamp, no return address, just my name in block letters, the kind that looked like they'd been carved instead of written. Inside was a single page, the paper thick and matte, like something pulled from an old military file. The handwriting was unmistakable, rigid, deliberate, still clinging to discipline, even in apology. I didn't know how to stand for you. I still want to try. Dad. No other words, no explanations, but I didn't need any. He had never called himself Dad in writing before. It had always been Colonel Collins, or just silence. Now it was 7 words that weighed more than every commendation pinned to my chest. I didn't rush to reply. I didn't draft a response. I simply packed a bag, polished my boots, and caught a red-eye to Arlington. It was spring again. The cherry blossoms were just starting to fall, tiny explosions of white and pink drifting between headstones like confetti from another life. I arrived just before noon, the cemetery quiet, save for the wind and the distant echo of a bugle ceremony far across the grounds. I knew the section by heart, Lot 42, east side, 3rd row back from the oak tree. My mother's grave was simple, elegant, her name etched with care beneath a single line from Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers. He was already there, no uniform, just a grey blazer and slacks, his posture still unnaturally straight. His hands were clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on the headstone like it held the answers neither of us had ever dared ask aloud. He turned when he heard my steps, didn't smile, didn't shift. I came in full dress, not to make a point, but because it was who I was now. The daughter who ironed his creases had become the woman who earned her own. For a moment we stood in silence, no handshake, no words, just the enormity of 20 years pressing between us. "I got your letter," I said. He nodded. "I didn't know what else to say," he admitted. "You said enough." Another pause. "She would have been proud," he said, eyes flicking to the headstone. "She was," I replied, "always was." He looked down, then away, then back. "I didn't come to the wedding because I didn't know how to sit among people who saw in you what I refused to." I let that land, let it sink. "I watched, though," he added quietly. "Heard them say Admiral on deck. Heard them stand." I raised an eyebrow. "And?" "And it made me want to stand too." The words were simple, but in his mouth they trembled with history. I stepped closer, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound. And then he did it. Slowly, deliberately. He raised his right hand in salute. It wasn't crisp. It wasn't regulation perfect, but it was real. His fingers touched his brow, his chin lifted, and for the first time, not as a soldier, not as a superior, but as a father, he saluted his daughter. I held his gaze, then returned the gesture, not out of protocol, but because, finally, he had chosen truth, and I would always answer that. When he lowered his hand, his eyes were glassy, but dry. "I don't expect this to fix anything," he said. "It doesn't have to," I replied. "It just has to start something." We stood for a while longer, speaking softly, about her, about regret, about how silence can masquerade as strength, but really just hides fear. Before we parted, he reached into his pocket and handed me something small, a photo. It was from my wedding, not the ones taken inside the chapel, but from behind the last row of pews, a long shot, the sabres raised, David and I walking beneath, seals saluting, and in the corner, a blurred figure just outside the threshold. Him, not standing, not saluting, just watching. "I almost came in," he said. I looked at him and said the truth aloud for the first time. "I didn't need you to walk in, I just needed you to stand." He looked down, then nodded, and this time I saw it. The beginnings of understanding, not of my rank, but of me. That night I returned to the base, sat at my desk beneath the dim yellow lamp, and opened my journal. I flipped past missions and names, past fragments of grief and pieces of command. On a blank page I wrote, "He saluted." No explanation. Because some moments don't need more than that. When the Pentagon called, I was in the middle of a sunrise run along the seawall at Norfolk, wind sharp and salt heavy, my breath steady in a cadence I'd long since mastered. The voice on the other end was formal, clipped, but the words landed with weight. "We'd like you to lead a new joint initiative, cross-branch command reform, with a focus on ethical leadership, trauma-resilient response, and long-term mental health support." I stopped mid-stride. Not because I was surprised, but because I had been waiting for this moment without realizing it. It wasn't a promotion, it was a reckoning. They weren't asking for decoration, they were asking for change, and they were asking me to be the tip of that spear. I accepted before the sentence finished. The program rolled out within months. We called it the Joint Readiness Reform Protocol, or JRRP. I worked with leaders from every branch. Army psychologists, Navy SEAL instructors, Air Force strategists, even Coast Guard emergency response teams. The aim wasn't to soften our forces, it was to strengthen them from the inside out. We built modules for situational de-escalation under stress. We integrated ethical dilemma training with real-time psychological check-ins. We implemented monthly peer assessments, not just for performance, but for presence, for empathy, for quiet leadership. And slowly, the needle began to move. Dropout rates lowered, disciplinary flags dropped. More soldiers started speaking up, not just about missions, but about meaning. 6 months into the program, I travelled to a small West Coast base, running one of our first pilot groups. It was a grey morning, mist clinging to the hangars like secrets. I stepped into the training hall and watched from the back as a group of recruits ran final drills, their movements sharp, controlled, but human. At the front of the line stood a young woman, barely 20, boots laced tight, eyes forward with a focus I knew too well. Something about her was familiar, not just the posture, but the stillness beneath it. When the session ended, I approached the instructor and asked for the roster. One name stopped me cold. Patterson, Avery. I blinked, asked to meet her. She arrived 10 minutes later, still in training gear, a bead of sweat trailing down her temple. "Admiral," she said, saluting smartly. I returned it, eyes scanning her features. "You named after anyone?" I asked. She hesitated. "Yes, ma'am. My father served under you, said you pulled him out of a bad op once, called you the calm inside the storm. He said if he ever had a daughter, he'd name her after the woman who saved his life." I couldn't speak right away. My throat tightened with a wave of memory I hadn't prepared for. I remembered her father, bloodied, half-conscious, cradled under my arm as bullets pinged off rusted steel. I remembered yelling into a radio, tourniquet wrapped with shaking hands, praying he'd live. And now here she was, boots planted, spine straight, eyes full of her own storms, and not afraid of them. She didn't know it, but she completed something. A circle I hadn't known was still open. She was the future, standing tall because someone once bent down in fire and said, "You matter, stay." And she had. She thanked me for the program, said it had kept her best friend from washing out. That the monthly debriefs helped her talk about her brother's suicide, something she hadn't done until training required it. As she walked away, I stood in the hallway alone for a moment, pressing one hand over the pocket of my jacket where my mother's watch still ticked beneath the fabric. That evening I sat in the officer's lounge, notebook open, pen poised, and wrote just one sentence. Sometimes the future salutes you before it knows your name. Because that's what legacy really is. Not awards or statues or lines on a bio. It's in the people who step forward because you once held the line. And for the first time, truly, I felt at peace. Not because I had proven anything, but because someone like her no longer had to. The auditorium was fuller than expected. Hundreds of service members, civilian officials, academy cadets, and press gathered beneath the wide arch of steel and light at the Joint Leadership Training Centre in Quantico. The ceremony was formal, structured, dignified, but quietly electric. They were naming the new standard after the program that had started with a single pilot session and grown into a nationwide overhaul. The salute standard, not for what's worn, but for what's earned. I stood at the edge of the stage behind a podium lined with nothing but my name, no rank, no titles. I requested it that way, because what mattered wasn't who I was, it was what the system had become. Before I spoke, the Commandant of the Marine Corps stepped forward with a brass plaque engraved with the words, "For her enduring example of command through compassion, clarity, and conviction, Admiral Avery Collins." The applause was thunderous. I nodded in appreciation, but I didn't smile wide. Not because I wasn't proud, but because something deeper stirred beneath the applause. I scanned the crowd, and I saw him, second row from the back, suit pressed, hands on his knees, Colonel William Collins, no longer active duty, no longer untouchable, just a man with greying temples and eyes fixed on the daughter he used to command in silence. I didn't expect him to be there. He hadn't RSVP'd, hadn't called, but I'd learned not to look for grand entrances with him. Just presence. When my name was called, I stepped forward. The weight of the moment settled across my shoulders like a fresh set of bars. My voice didn't shake, because I wasn't standing alone. I used to believe that respect came from position, I began, from rank, from precision, from how well you followed orders. A pause. But I've learned that the most powerful leadership doesn't bark, it doesn't boast, it listens. It notices, it stands when others sit. A murmur of agreement. Years ago, I stood behind a chapel door, about to walk down the aisle in full uniform, and I heard 200 men rise and shout, "Admiral on deck!" They weren't told to stand. They chose to. Another pause. That is the salute standard. I turned slightly, eyes finding him again in the crowd. And sometimes the most important salutes aren't the ones given for protocol. They're the ones that arrive after years of silence. The ones that say, "I see you, I finally see you." I closed the speech simply. Leadership isn't about being the first to speak. It's about being the last to turn away. As the room rose in ovation, I stepped back. And in the corner of my eye, I saw him, my father. Standing, his back was straight, his hand moved to his brow, not with precision, but with reverence, not for the military, not for tradition, for me, the woman he once said could never wear the uniform he worshipped, the daughter he didn't know how to hold, but finally chose to honour. I didn't cry, but something behind my eyes blurred, an entire lifetime rising in my chest like a tide I no longer feared. After the ceremony, I didn't seek him out. He didn't approach. We exchanged no words. But as I stepped into the corridor and out into the early evening light, my fingers brushed the engraved back of the old watch on my wrist. For my stormbird fly. And I whispered to no one, "You finally saw me." Later that night, back in my quarters, I opened my journal one last time. On a clean page, I wrote, "Some salutes take a lifetime, but when they come, they rewrite the silence." And then I closed the book, not because the story was over, but because for once it didn't have to be retold.